Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 28th of September in the 39th week of 2012. For more than 20 years, our program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and Ron Szoke. We'll take turns suggesting an item from the week's news that's been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently, and then giving the others a chance to comment on it. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20 years that we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Today is September 28. On this day in 1973, the ITT building in New York City was bombed in a protest at ITT's involvement in the first 9/11, the September 11th, 1973 coup in Chile. General Pinochet's forces in Chile bombed the presidential palace there on the 11th of September in 73, in what was Latin America's oldest and most vibrant democracy, and established a regime of torture and repression thanks primarily to its secret police organization, DINA, D-I-N-A, that U.S. military and even U.S. military intelligence compared to the KGB and the Gestapo, which is interesting, of course, because Washington was the primary sponsor of Pinochet and DINA. The official death toll of the first 9/11 was 3,200, roughly comparable in numbers to 9/11 2001. But on the population base of Chile, that would correspond to about 50,000 in the U.S., and indeed many, many more people were killed in the coup, which was not an isolated attack, but rather an overthrow of a democratically elected government. Pinochet's DINA, soon moved to integrate Latin American dictatorships in the international state terrorist program called Operation Condor. It killed and tortured mercilessly throughout Latin America, and branched out to terrorist operations in Europe and even the U.S. The evil genius behind it, General Pinochet, was greatly honored by Reagan and Thatcher in particular, but quite generally. The assassination of a member of the former government, the Democratic government, in the streets of Washington, D.C., Orlando Letelier and associates, in a car bomb in the middle of Washington, D.C., in Embassy Row. That was going a bit too far, though, for the U.S. government backers of General Pinochet, and he was told to tone down the international terrorism coming from Chile in those days. The worst atrocities, in fact, of this U.S.-sponsored terrorist operation were yet to come, though that was in Argentina, and then eventually the expansion of the state terror into Central America in the 1980s, leaving hundreds of thousands of corpses and 4 countries in ruins, including or eliciting, finally, a condemnation of the U.S. by the World Court, the only one in history, for terrorism, for unlawful use of force in these wars. What the U.S. did to Latin America in those years after the first 9/11 has been entirely forgotten, I think, by most North Americans, but it's not forgotten in South America, and it's a background to the remarkable resurgence in in recent years of Latin America in opposition to American policy and the establishment of, in some ways, the most progressive region of the world, most progressive governments in any region of the world in Latin America. Today is also the anniversary in the year 2000 of the beginning of the Al-Aqsa Intifada. Ariel Sharon of the Likud party, a candidate for Prime Minister of Israel, visited the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, accompanied by roughly 1,000 security guards, that is, a military troop, and stated on that day, quote, "The Temple Mount is in our hands," he meant the government of Israel, "and will remain in our hands. It is the holiest site in Jerusalem, it is the holiest site in Judaism, and it is the right of every Jew to visit the Temple Mount," close quote. Well, his visit to the Temple Mount, in the context of the disputes over the 1993 Oslo Accords, led to 5 days of rioting and clashes, apparently set up by the IDF, which was expecting just such a reaction to Sharon's move. The death toll of those first few days, 47 Palestinians and 5 Israelis, but it set off this second intifada, which lasted into 2005, which killed perhaps 6,000 Palestinians and maybe 1,000 Israelis, Jews and Arabs. The memorial is, or the anniversary is worth remembering, particularly after the remarkable display this week by the Prime Minister of Israel with his cartoon on the podium at the United Nations. Juan Cole, a observer not unfriendly to the U.S. government, argues that Netanyahu's warmongering against Iran is finally primarily about the Palestinians. Quote, "Netanyahu wants to remove all hope from the Palestinians so as to keep them permanently stateless and to ensure that their land is available for Israeli encroachment," close quote, writes Juan Cole, and suggests that the warmongering against Iran is a way to accomplish that. We can't possibly do anything for the Palestinians, even move towards the notion of a two-state solution or anything else, because of the imminent threat of Iran to exterminate Israel, as Benjamin Netanyahu says. So, you are watching News from Neptune, the Proprium Humanae edition. I take the line from the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote, "Proprium Humanae ingeniae et odissi cum laceris." It is human nature to hate a person whom you have injured. So, we will begin with Ron Szoke, who will have the first injuries of the day.
Right. Well, I want to mention some injuries, as it's thought, to the body politic, especially in Greece and Spain. The harvest of the austerity movement is becoming evident in Greece and Spain. Rioting in the streets, the old barricades and bonfires approach to public dissatisfaction. The middle class there is being reduced to poverty. They are cutting public expenses and jobs, and it's becoming a more and more volatile situation. And yet I predict that the owning class, the 1% of Greece and of Spain, will learn nothing from this. Pitiful picture in the New York Times last week of people looking in the dumpsters and garbage, trying to find food. The most prosperous area of Spain, Catalonia, is making louder and louder noises about seceding from Spain. And it looks bad. Of course, Italy is said to be next on the list, but how close they are to this kind of unrest is not clear to me. So we have not reached this point yet where there's massive public demonstrations and rebellion in the USA. Is it possible that will happen here in 5 or 10 years? Who's to say? But meanwhile, we have this ever-emerging and sharper conflict of perceptions and worldviews between the 1% and the 99%, or however you want to cut it, the 2% and the 98%, or the 47% and the 53%, or whatever. What's more and more obvious to me about the 1%, the really big rich, is that they've become an incredible bunch of whining and self-pitying crybabies, moaning that, as Paul Krugman has said, Obama is looking at them funny, and they don't like what he's saying. We need to restore investor confidence. Confidence in what? Ever greater profits, apparently. So if you have confidence in ever greater profits, then what you don't need is profits. The classic justification for taking profits is that you've taken a risk. And if you take no risk, then you should be put on salary and not allowed to make a profit according to the official theory, or so it would seem. But they never seem to look at it that way. So the statement from Charles Murray, one of the principal right-wing ideologues recently, in the Wall Street Journal about why capitalism has an image problem. It's not a real problem, of course, it's just an image problem. Yeah. And we need to change people's perceptions.
Right.
He does mention a change in the objective conditions has been the emergence of great fortunes made quickly in the financial markets. It's always been easy for Americans to applaud people who get rich by creating products and services that people want to buy. That is why Thomas Edison and Henry Ford were American heroes a century ago. And Steve Jobs was one when he died last year. But when great wealth is generated instead by making smart buy and sell decisions in the markets, it smacks of inside knowledge, arcane financial instruments, opportunities that aren't accessible to ordinary people, and hocus pocus. The good that these rich people have done in the process of getting rich is obscure. I'll say it's obscure. The benefits of more efficient allocation of capital are huge, but they are really, really hard to explain simply and persuasively. It looks to a large portion of the public as if we've got some fabulously wealthy people who haven't done anything to deserve their wealth. Yes, how true. So we always hear about the problem of the moral fiber of the poor and how they must be made to see the inevitability of working hard if they want to get rich or even to survive. They must sweat and strain and struggle and learn the value of a dollar. But we never hear that about the big rich for some reason. How do we make them learn the value of a dollar? Well, that's still left in the dark. So we have the problem then we're constantly hearing about of consumer confidence on the one hand, but investor confidence on the other. And Paul Krugman keeps writing about the big investors wanting to be waiting for him, Obama, or someone to sprinkle the fairy dust of investor confidence. And they're complaining that the 1% are complaining that they're just not getting that. So there it is, gentlemen.
Thank you, Ron. How do you feel about the confidence fairy, David?
Well, little did I know when I came in here that Charles Murray was going to set us free.
Yeah.
I mean, he's given the capitalist class the rope with which to hang itself. I mean, as I guess a social cultural theorist or a social psychologist or something like that, he's seemed to generate at least some of the right questions about the way capitalism works, although he doesn't have the right answers. He's asking the questions as a way of sort of avoiding the answers, and I think one of the answers has to do with the inflated role of the financial capitalism in our economic system, and all of the inefficiencies that have gone along with that. I think the data I've seen is that the portion of our economy devoted to finance now has gone from something like 4% to 8%, or maybe it's the percentage of profits. I'm not sure what it is, but if you look at the latest Forbes 400, you see both increases in wealth and increases in representation among those, all of these people, many of which you've never heard of, who are enormously wealthy and probably would prefer that you haven't heard of them, who are making billions of dollars or have achieved billions of dollars of wealth as hedge fund managers, venture capitalists, and various financial roles, all of which, as I think good economists point out, we need efficient allocation of capital in investment to be a society that's growing in productivity, which is the bottom line. Beyond distribution of wealth, it's the growth in productivity. But when financial capitalism becomes, when the financial aspect of capitalism becomes, which is really just moving money around, often in ways that aren't even intended to increase productivity or put people to work, then what all that can be seen is that those people are making lots of money and everybody else is sort of floundering around trying to figure out how to make do with less.
Yeah, it's amazing the amount of money to be made simply by shuffling ownership certificates and redistributing them among the very wealthy.
And that is the point. I think needs to be stressed in our political discussion, because that really is a change from the capitalism of the age of Edison and Ford and who you mentioned, and it's a change that's happened in our lifetime. I mean, it's really the last 30 years that the U.S. has moved from an economy that really did produce things in factories in the United States, things that people needed, food, clothing, and shelter and so forth, produced in the United States for consumption here and abroad through exports. We moved from that. We offshored that production and sent it elsewhere. It was much easier to make this stuff in China, easier in the sense that you didn't have to pay the workers as much, and therefore the owners did better to move the factories to China. And then the economy became, as you suggested, Ron, a matter of shuffling paper, trading ownership certificates to this economy, which had now been offshored. We speak of that as a financialization of the economy, from manufacture to from manufacturing to financialization, and with that, an epical change in the economic life of Americans, and the result has been an American austerity. It's being taken out of the hide of Americans, but it's being done under such a fog of misrepresentation, because the 1% control the media and control the form of the discussion, that it becomes an issue of, as you put it, whether Obama is looking at the rich funny. Now, in fact, Obama is working for exactly this process of financialization we're talking about. His masters are that 1%, as David points out, a fraction of the 1%, and he is as much their creature as Romney is. The question is one of rhetoric. Can he find a better way to say it? Can he tell people that, yes, we probably should tax the income of some of these rich people a little bit more? Yeah, maybe we shouldn't say things like that 47% thing that Mr. Romney said so honestly. And I believe, too, says Obama in his secret heart, but still in all, we can't say things like that. And the parallel transformation of American liberalism from a critique of the economy as it existed 30 years ago to a vast list of things you can't say is represented, it seems to me, by Barack Obama, perhaps better than anybody else right now because of his position in the country. It's an amazing situation, and one that that has to be obfuscated for the majority of Americans. If Americans realized what was being done to them, we would have the same sort of outrage in the streets that you're talking about in Greece and Spain. Well, it may come. I had occasion this week to dust off Sinclair Lewis's 1935 novel, It Can't Happen Here, when he speculated on the coming to America of the political transformations that the Great Depression produced in Europe. Now, the past is prologue, as we point out around here, but in Mark Twain's words, the past doesn't repeat itself, it does rhyme. And the possibility of rhymes on this matter seems to me to be, at least in the air this week. You're listening to News from Neptune, and we are pressing on now. David, I think it's your turn at the controls.
Okay, I'm going to mention two things. Rashid Khalidi, the well-known Palestinian-American scholar of the Middle East and Israel and Palestine in particular, visited our campus this week and gave a very good talk, a very great talk, I would say, Wednesday evening over at Levis Faculty Center, which addressed the issue of whether or not the United States has been and could be an honest broker in the Israel-Palestine so-called peace process, which is always put into quotes. And of course, the answer from him, and as an aspect of an upcoming book that he has, is a resounding no. And he talked quite well and quite interestingly for an hour and took questions in regard to this question to a very receptive audience on campus. I would like to note that one of the things he talked about most in passing, and it really became more of a central theme to his talk, was not the relationship of the United States to Israel, but the relationship of the United States to Saudi Arabia. And it occurred to me after the talk that he'd really made an argument for the fact that not only has Israel been a strategic asset in militarily protecting Saudi Arabia and our access to their oil resources and so forth, but that the so-called democratic image of Israel and the so-called shared values of our relationship with Israel over the years have served as a kind of very effective, at least until now, ideological cover for the fact that the primary concern of the United States foreign policy in that part of the world is our relationship in supporting and preserving this incredibly corrupt and unegalitarian in many ways and authoritarian Saudi regime, which in fact our relationship, of course, goes back to the 1930s. In doing so, he pointed out that in spite of the financial relationship we have with Saudi Arabia, meaning we buy oil from them and they buy arms from us to keep our arms merchants busy. In spite of that, Saudi Arabia is completely incapable of defending itself against any other force in the region if it had to, and therefore dependent is dependent on us or on the United States, as well as perhaps is Israel in defending itself, given whatever sophisticated weapons Saudi Arabia may have bought from us. They can't use them all that well, according to Khalidi, and I'm sure he's right. He's extremely well informed on these matters. So I wanted to put that out there in terms of promoting his book and the idea that turning to the events this weekend vis-a-vis Israel, Iran, and so forth. I guess what's remarkable about that partly is that Netanyahu could speak at the United Nations, of course, on the same day that Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian, I guess what they call president, spoke also, but that Netanyahu really did not deal with the Palestinian issue. It was left to Abbas to make a few comments on that. So where we go from here, I think, is one topic I would put out there, and perhaps I should stop there and and perhaps address my other topic
It's a subject,
later if there's time.
subject I think we have a lot to say about. Ron, you want to take a crack at that?
No, well, the U.S. tries to advertise itself as an honest broker in the Palestinian-Israel conflict, of course, and everyone knows that that's laughable. But still, the pretense is being made, and should we take some comfort in the notion that the hypocrisy continues, hypocrisy being the tribute that vice plays to virtue, as someone said about
Right.
Foucault or something. But anyway, do we acquiesce in the total subjugation of the Palestinians to Israel and the IDF? And it looks as if in the longer term that's what we've been doing, but is there any hope of turning that around? So is there more hope of doing that if Obama or Romney occupies the White House next January?
Occupies, not to put too fine a point on it, right?
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Does it make any difference?
No, I don't think it has, and I think that's one of the diversions of this election has been going back to Romney's comments about the so-called cultural inferiority of the Palestinians, the idea that there really has been any difference, and what Khalidi pointed out the other night was that Obama, instead of simply saving his most supportive fawning towards Israel comments to the annual AIPAC conference, that last year in Obama's remarks at the United Nations around this time last year, he was the first president to actually give the kind of speech to the United Nations that most presidents that presidents before him had only given to AIPAC. In other words, a fawning support and identification and assurance that Israel is the United States' primary ally. We wouldn't desert them, and the special relationship and all that. So, if anything, Obama, like Democratic presidents before him, Clinton, and it's perhaps hard to talk about Carter, but there haven't been too many Democrats to choose from lately. But both Clinton and Obama have been as quote unquote loyal to Israel, or loyal to our strategic relationship to Israel, and as implicitly supportive of the settlements and so on, as certainly the elder Bush, and who was actually might have had a few more problems, and then even George W. Bush when he first came into office. So, but there hasn't been any difference.
Well, how do you account for the fact that the right-wingers are constantly attacking Obama for not being sufficiently pro-Israel?
They think they can score points against Obama on that point. It's the same way Coke attacks Pepsi for not being effervescent enough.
I think it's been a kind of cat and mouse game and a kind of coy game by the Democratic strategists regarding Israel. I think part of it is to let people think that to actually allow people to think that Obama is quote unquote more lenient or more supportive of the Palestinians, because they understand there's a portion of the Democratic electorate or the Democratic base that's actually critical of Obama from the left, including some Jews, some of these allegedly so important Jewish voters, who, if anything, would decide not to vote for Obama because he hasn't been tough enough on Israel.
The right-wing websites were all a Twitter this morning, not on Twitter, sorry, old-fashioned language, were agog, perhaps, about the fact that Susan Rice, the awful American representative from the ambassador to the UN, went and had lunch with Hillary Clinton rather than attending Netanyahu's speech at the UN. And they connected to the fact that much has been made that Obama was too busy to talk to Netanyahu in person when he came to New York, that there will be a phone call later or something like that. Well, this the sort of war party in the United States, which of course cuts across the two major parties, as we say, the war party is excited as can be about this because it shows that Obama is not sufficiently committed to Israel, and therefore we need a president who is more committed. Now, look. What's going on here is this struggle between the Israeli government, the government of Israel, and the United States over who's going to arrange the attack on Iran. I mean, the attack on Iran is already underway. The U.S. is acting towards Iran in a way that, if any other country acted towards the U.S., would be a declaration of war. The U.S. is doing this, but Israel is much more interested in manipulating the United States into the position of widening the war. Well, Obama is not too unhappy with that. The American government wants to widen the war, not for any of the reasons you've heard about, not for any of the arguments about nuclear weapons, but because Iran is a roadblock against the constant U.S. policy to control the energy resources of the Middle East. Actually, someone said that at the UN last week. But since it was President Ahmadinejad, it wasn't taken seriously as an analysis of the situation by the American media. So we're left with the reportage that we've received, and it's not very good. We say our program is a discussion of the events of the week and its coverage by the media, and I thought this week saw some of the most execrable coverage by the media that we've seen in some time, and that's saying something, because when you ask why Americans are so misled about the politics of the Middle East, why they're so misled about what is actually going on in regard to Israel, Iran, and so forth, the answer has got to be that's what they hear. That's all they hear. We have a one-party press in this country, and the fact that it's decentralized, that the News Gazette is different from Reuters or something, or the Associated Press or something like that, covers over the fact that they're saying exactly the same thing. And that one-party press gives us an account of the Middle East that's pure fantasy. And it takes a great deal of effort. The information is out there. You can find it if you look for it. But you got to dig around and get a very, you get a very different picture from the one that we get. The editorials in the News Gazette this week are not to be believed, literally and figuratively. That is, they're not, don't believe them. And secondly, they're astonishing in how far they go, even further than the rabid material that we get from the other parts of the one-party press. There are people who say that the internet doesn't, the internet undercuts the one-party press in this country. I must admit I doubt it. There's a story out there, an absolutely false story, that comes from the fact that we get absolutely false reporting.
Well, yeah, if you go looking at Al Jazeera and RT and so on, you can find these deviant things. I find that even USA Today, the McClatchy papers, will surface things that you would not expect to see, even on Reuters or the Associated Press.
I've got to think of one about Reuters right now from a blogger. See my comments about the internet a moment ago, and I'll take them back. But a blogger, a fellow calls himself News Vandal, has a nice piece about the reportage from Reuters this week. He points out that the Reuters headline that moved after the president of Iran's speech from the UN was, I quote, "In New York, defiant Ahmadinejad says Israel will be eliminated." Eliminated is in quotes, a quote from Ahmadinejad. As it just sounds par for the course when it comes to Iran's dangerous doom dealer, right? Well, there's a bit of a problem. You see, the headline doesn't quite match the actual quote in the story. Rather than delivering on their big tease with a blistering rant about destroying Israel with a hail of newly minted nuclear weapons, Ahmadinejad's quote in paragraph 11 of the story comes across a bit differently. Now, this is Reuters. Remember, Reuters is an old line, it was founded in the middle of the 19th century, a news service that's used by, most of the news you actually see in the newspaper comes from the Associated Press or Reuters, one of these wires. Here's what Ahmadinejad, here's the quote from Ahmadinejad buried in the Reuters account. Quote, "We don't even count them," he was referring to Israel, "as any part of any equation for Iran. During a historical phase, they," that is the Israelis, "represent minimal disturbances that come into the picture and are then eliminated," close quote. And he went on to talk about the long-term history of Iran, the oldest societies, et cetera, et cetera. In the story, that quote follows a number of other quotes responding to questions about the possibility of an Israeli attack on Iran, to which Ahmadinejad offers a number of dismissive responses and some blustery posturing about Iran's centuries-long history and fearlessness in the face of these threats. Quote, "Fundamentally, we do not take seriously the threats of the Zionists," Ahmadinejad said. "We have all the defensive means at our disposal, and we're ready to defend ourselves." And, quote, "We do not believe that they found themselves at a dead end and they are seeking new adventures." Sorry, let's have that again. Ahmadinejad said, "We do believe that they, the Israelis, have found themselves at a dead end," he means in promoting the war, "and are seeking new adventures in order to escape this dead end. Iran will not be damaged with foreign bombs." Okay. Now, you put this into the context of the full interview, and even more alarming, taking the actual quote referenced by Reuters in their gussied-up headline, it seems that Ahmadinejad is referring to threats made by Netanyahu, and that Iran, which sadly he is speaking for in this interview, simply eliminates the minimal disturbances that come into the picture. In other words, it disregards what Netanyahu has to say. This is turned by the Reuters account into the immediate threat of a second Holocaust. You know, that's what he's doing. And if you think that they're overstating it, look at what the News Gazette said on Wednesday. You gotta read this to believe it. Iran's vow, death to Israel. It gets worse, if that's possible. I quote the editorial staff of the News Gazette. "It's nothing new when leaders of Iran announce both their intention and desire to wipe Israel off the map of the Middle East. Various Iranian leaders make statements to that effect every few weeks." This week, Ahmadinejad used the UN's annual meeting to restate what can only be described if you're in the American media, as his country's intention to annihilate the people of Israel. So Ahmadinejad says, I'm not going to pay attention to his threats, becomes a threat to annihilate the people of Israel. That's astonishing. That's a lot of work. That really is something that's, it takes serious professionals to do that. Listen, there's more. From the News Gazette. "It's no secret that Iran has been moving as fast as possible to build a nuclear program aimed at developing the kind of weapons that can destroy Israel." Even the American government doesn't say that. Even Israel doesn't say that. Netanyahu, with his little cartoon of a bomb in front of them, is drawing red lines. He says, well, we're up to this point in enriching uranium, and they could go in and have one bomb, and we've got 400, and, that might be a problem, so forth and so. No, the News Gazette believes that they are just a step away from raining nuclear weapons down on Israel. Now, the problem with all this, we can make fun of the ridiculousness of what the News Gazette says, but their last paragraph is unfortunately correct. "Suffice it to say, the situation is extremely dangerous, and it's hard to imagine that no matter who starts it, some sort of military conflict will not erupt in the coming months. Once it starts, if it starts, impossible to say how it will end, but Ahmadinejad went out of his way this week to let the world know how he wants it to end, with the destruction of Israel." Okay, so they put it back to that, but what they recognize under these silly lies, is the fact that Israel is very much trying to get the U.S. to attack Iran, and attacking Iran is what the U.S. is in fact doing and is willing to do more of, regardless of who's president. So we go from a fantasy world to a world of very serious threat indeed, and it takes more accurate accounts than the American press are willing to give us for us to have any sort of serious understanding of what's going on here.
The greater theme of that speech, it seemed to me, was not so much eliminating or obliterating Israel, but of changing the domination of the world by the USA.
Exactly.
A plea for a new world order which would not be completely dominated and controlled by the USA and, of course, its sidekick, Israel.
And of course, in the midst of that, as he said, the reason the USA is in the position to sponsor its chief client in a war against Iran in the first place is the U.S. insistence for generations now on controlling the world's greatest energy resources, which happen to be located in the Middle East. Now, Ahmadinejad says this at the UN. When Obama goes to the UN, he talks about how we're protecting civilians and how we're fighting terrorism and so forth, you know. No mention of what the U.S. is actually doing.
I would add that what the News Gazette does and has done since the Arab Spring is to sort of denigrate at every opportunity the Muslim world or the Arab world or Arab culture and their ability or inability to govern themselves or to aspire to the kind of democratic values that we have in this country at every point, whether it's with the election of Morsi in Egypt or whatever. They reaffirm their notion that these people just aren't ready for prime time, and therefore we still must fear them, and that there's still a kind of civilizational conflict. And I would propose that this kind of slightly more sophisticated expressions of Islamophobia are really more important in understanding, in terms of understanding Islamophobia and its real effects, in comparison to talking about Islamophobia in the context of this movie or even events in Libya. I think that this general, this kind of pervasive condescension to the Arab world and the Muslim world is really part of it. And actually, the second point that I was going to make before had to do with a column that was featured on the commentary section last Sunday by a retired university psychology professor named Harry Triandis, in which he spells out sort of this in a more sophisticated way, the nature of this inferiority of the Islamic world and the fact that they're not really ready to take responsibility in the way that we might like them to. And I found it an extremely unsupportable argument and decontextualized argument about what is going on in the world, and perhaps more dangerous for having been expressed not by the extreme right-wing editorial board, but basically by a liberal professor of psychology with a relatively decent reputation.
Islamophobia is a peculiar problem, in a way, for the American government. Obviously, the U.S. government uses it in its propaganda. These Islamic fanatics and so forth who are responsible for the reason that we have to kill people in the Middle East is a good cover for what the U.S. can admit, that is the real reason that it's killing people in the Middle East. Now, really can't talk about that. And Islamophobia works very nicely because we say, oh, these terrible killers. This is just almost at random from another News Gazette article. We're reminded once again of the danger posed by Islamic extremists who use murder and violence on the weakest of pretexts, to achieve their political goals. Now, that's something.
I'm glad that we don't do that.
Yes, exactly.
Use violence to achieve our political goals.
On the weakest of pretexts.
Right.
That's right. Yeah. No, this is astonishing stuff. But as I say, there's a problem for the U.S. government in this regard because it can mobilize this stuff and get local editors to write nonsense like that. But then there's the problem that David mentioned a moment ago, Saudi Arabia. The second great client of the U.S. strategic plan for the Middle East, the first, of course, is Israel, is Saudi Arabia. and Saudi Arabia happens to be the world's leading fundamentalist Muslim state. The problem is worldwide. In the Obama administration's tilt toward China, we run across Indonesia, which is, in fact, the world's largest Muslim country, largest in terms of population, and the fact that the U.S. At one point saw the real reason for the Vietnam War was control of Indonesia. And when a massive genocide, pretty close, was set off in Indonesia by the CIA in 1965, it was trumpeted by American planners as a example of how important the Vietnam War was in making sure other dominoes didn't fall. The victims of the CIA, of the mass murder in Indonesia in 1965 were the Indonesian Communist Party and those who objected to the essentially military rule of Indonesia that the U.S. backed. Now, when the U.S. has these uncomfortable Muslim allies, only so much Islamophobia is useful, or it has to be kept in the proper place, Of course, Muslims are horrifying terrorists who use terrible, silly excuses to attack us. Of course, not our friends in Saudi Arabia and Indonesia, and therefore it gets a little awkward to write the propaganda in Washington. But that doesn't lessen the influence or the effect of this Islamophobic nonsense that we get from official sources in America as part of its excuse for its war.
Some of it, I think, is just good old-fashioned ethnocentrism tinged with racism and so on. Those foreigners, and that will always appeal to a certain group of people. But that has to be very carefully handled, I think.
But I think it's become a more complicated thing in the era, in the post-racial era and the era of identity politics and tolerance and all this stuff. And I guess and this is perhaps a naive question, but I would be interested to know if either of you has a non-naive response to it. But why in this sophisticated university town would it seemingly be so difficult for people who know better to create a somewhat different tone, even in the mainstream media, regarding, and this, I assume this has been done, for instance, on the public radio with Focus 5, the late Focus 580 and so forth. But why it frustrates me, and again, I'm probably not naive to be frustrated by this, that the voices of people who have a more sophisticated understanding of culture and politics are really not heard.
I think that's a very important question.
Yeah. Well, where do you think you are? Ann Arbor or Cambridge?
No.
You think they're heard? Do you think they're heard any more in Ann Arbor
exactly.
or Cambridge?
No, we're talking.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
No, but I don't think it's much different from campus to campus. I think David's right about that. But I do think there is a tremendous difference in the academy from now to a generation ago, and that's not an accident. It is really astonishing to see what's happened in the American university, where I have spent my adulthood. And my childhood, too, come to think of it. In any case, it's astonishing to see what's happened in recent years in terms of the quiescence of the university, faculty and students. If you compare the last decade with almost any previous decade going back to the 1960s, you're struck by just how dumb, in the literal sense, American universities are. They're absolutely deaf and dumb. Apparently they're deaf. No, that can't be true. They must be hearing this stuff. Surely they actually have to read it. But the silence is deafening. And it's astonishing, and it's not an accident. The university has been, indeed it's bound up with neoliberalism, has been the target of intellectual control over the last generation, even more than it was in the previous generation. And in fact, it was precisely because the control lessened a little in the previous generation that it's been reasserted with such force in this generation. And so we have, in the midst of 10 years of war, a quiet academy, students and teachers responding to very real pressures that are brought to bear on them. It's a tragedy, but it's not an accident.
To me, there's a broader theme here, the corporatization of the university and how tightly it has become integrated into the whole corporate structure and indeed international corporate structure.
Yeah, and put into that everything from student debt. You know, it's no accident that it's far more expensive in terms of the debt that one takes on to go to college, even so-called public college, today than it was a generation ago. That's not just happened. You know, that's a real attempt to try to make sure that universities are quiet. There was this week a remarkable article on the Counterpunch website about the Kent State shootings in 1970, where the National Guard opened fire on protesting students, and it's been treated in all the accounts of it in the intervening 40 years, you know, as a terrible breakdown of command, what a shame, an accident, you know, too bad. That's what happens when these things get out of hand and so forth. Now it seems that it is a much more directly planned and direct assault on the students, that they meant to do it. The National Guard was sent there with directions from the Nixon administration, you know, to take some action. That they put into action what the governor of California, a man named Reagan, had said: if there's to be a bloodbath, let it begin here. And they decided to do it, and they did it.
One of the survivors of that event claims to have a definitive recording of the order being given to shoot the student protesters.
And that has particular interest today when we see things like indefinite detention without trial, police assaults on protesters exercising their rights under the Bill of Rights, a crackdown that is occurring throughout the country it's hard to think that this isn't motivated by the administration's thought that it's not going to be fooled again by anti-war protests or anti-austerity protests of the sort that you were talking about abroad, Ron, and that they're ready for them this time. And since there's a very interesting passage in Barack Obama's Audacity of Hope, where he talks about, it seems to me, being ready for the next time, it's not much of a stretch to see the recent actions by the administration in this regard to be just as repressive as what was going on in Kent State in 1970.
A couple of points to embellish this theme. Headline from USA Today, September 10th: colleges recoup recession losses, big investment gains, tuition cuts unlikely. So,
what a surprise.
Yeah, led by big investment gains in 2011, U.S. colleges have built investment behemoths and rainy day funds of more than $408 billion, and most have recouped recession losses, according to a USA Today analysis. So this says endowments fund dorms, staff, and more. They're not decreasing tuition. They're turning the colleges more and more into things that resemble country clubs and luxury spas.
Country clubs for some. I think a lot of students and a lot of adjunct faculty, whose numbers have grown immensely, while the tenured faculty have declined in numbers a good bit. Yeah. They might disagree about the country club description.
Yes. Another point, headline in local paper, Wise expects to stay on Nike board. President of the University of Illinois is also on the board of directors of the Nike Corporation, with which the U of I has a big contract for athletic gear. This says, in return for serving on Nike's board last year, Wise received $83,000 in fees, $139,560 in option awards, and $15,000 in other awards, for a total of $237,889, according to Nike's proxy statement. And then in addition, well, she says, I give to the university, I give my time and money, and I would like to keep that private, she said. As vice president and chancellor at Urbana, Wise earns a salary of $500,000 a year, $500,000 a year, plus $100,000 for each year if she stays for 5 years.
Now look, she's got a complaint here, Ron. The assistant football coach at Clemson this week was announced would receive a salary of $1.3 million.
Correct.
She's not even making half of what an assistant football coach is making. Well, you know, something has to be done. You've been watching news from Neptune. For September 28th in the 39th week of 2012. Our program is named in honor of Noam Chomsky. This has been the Proprium Humanae edition with a quote from the Roman historian Tacitus, "It's human nature to hate a person you have injured." I want to recall this week the deaths of two very different quondam communists. Irving Adler, born in 1913, died this week. He was the author of vast series of science and math books for the young, came out in the middle of the century. There's a tradition now gone of writing by scientists and others for the masses, so to speak, by making popular materials available. Adler was a wonderful example. His books are still very much worth reading. I remember them from the old days. This, as Noam Chomsky himself has pointed out, this is a tradition that's disappeared. With this split of the intellectuals from the society at large, we don't find people who feel they have an obligation to speak to ordinary people, people who are not in universities, people who are not professionally trained. And it's something we should remember, particularly with the disappearance of men like Adler.
Asimov did continue that to some extent, but of course he's gone now too.
Isaac Asimov reviewed Adler's. I was reading Asimov's review of Adler's books, in the. In his obituary. The second quondam communist that I want to remember is Jean Genovese, the historian of the Slave South, whose late wife, I taught at the University of Rochester when Genovese was there. His late wife was a friend of mine from graduate school. And Genovese came to people's consciousness during the Vietnam era at a teach-in in 1965 at Rutgers. Genovese said, "Those of you who know me know that I'm a Marxist and a socialist. Therefore, unlike most of my distinguished colleagues here this morning, I do not fear or regret the impending Viet Cong victory in Vietnam. I welcome it," close quote. Well, this became an issue in the New Jersey gubernatorial race and led on to certain notoriety for Jean Genovese, who much enjoyed the notoriety. But he has a peculiar intellectual career. His contributions to history of the Slave South can, I think, not be denied, but his political opinions tended to wander a good bit after that, and he ended up, his last book was a praise of the Southern agrarians, the poets who essentially rejected Enlightenment accounts of society and capitalism, but as it were from the other direction of his one-time communist allies. So Jean and Betsy are remembered by us as equivocal comrades in the Long March. If our program has interested you, you might want to look for similar programs here on Urbana Public Television, now streaming online. You can watch us on your computer. And go to urbanapublictelevision.org, all one word, and hit the live stream button. Tomorrow at 7 a.m., the David Pakman Show. At 2 p.m., a repeat of this show. At 3 p.m., the Populist Dialogues, Restorative Justice's Healing for Victims and Offenders. At 9 p.m., $1 a Day, this series from Link TV, chronicles people under the poverty line around the globe as they face challenges ranging from finding basic needs like clean water to competing in international markets. That's their summary, huh? This Sunday at 7:30 a.m., the White House Chronicle. At 3:30 p.m., the Populist Dialogues rebroadcast, program I just mentioned. At 4 p.m., Labor's Worldview with our friends David Johnson and Jim Iman. At 11 p.m., Alternatives to Incarceration. The Town Hall Forum held here last week is rebroadcast. During the upcoming week at 7 a.m. every weekday, Democracy Now! At 8 a.m., The Big Picture. At noon, The David Pakman Show. On Monday, coming at 1 p.m., Labor's Worldview, repeated. It's a new time for the weekly rebroadcast of David and Jim's program. At 5 p.m. on Monday, European Journal. Tuesday at 7 p.m., the European Journal is rebroadcast, and at 10 p.m., Aware on the Air is is broadcast for the first time and rebroadcast later in the week. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussions tonight on News from Neptune have been David Green and Ron Szoke. This and other editions of the program can be seen on the website newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I can be reached, actually it's not Facebook, Caleb's been putting on something else. What is it called? Anyhow, look for it, Google it, you can find us. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.